I lived in the most expensive and poorest area of Japan, and in this video, I'm going to talk about three main differences that I noticed while living in those apartments. Hi, my name's YOODOO. I was born in Japan and lived over 10 years of my life in Japan as an adult. And in this video, I want to talk about this because I'm sure there's a lot of people moving to Japan currently, as well as people who are just interested in hearing about lifestyles and experiences of Japan. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about two areas that I lived in. The poorest area that I lived in Japan, which is in the Kansai area, is called Shin Imamiya, and I made a video about that, talking about my apartment. So if you want to watch that video, you can go over there. I'm going to be comparing the area called Shin Imamiya, and the richest area that I lived was an area called Ashiya, which is in between Kobe and Osaka, right in the middle. It's known to be the Beverly Hills of Japan. If you ask any local Japanese person or anyone who lives in the Kansai area and you tell them that you live in Ashiya, they would definitely be surprised because it's an area that's associated with a lot of rich families and a lot of old rich money. And the reason why I moved to Ashiya was because it was an area that was closer and more centrally located, so I could have easy access to visit my grandmother who needed help with shopping for groceries and stuff. So that's the reason why I moved to Ashiya. It was just a better location than when I was living in Shin Imamiya. So I'm actually moved to Ashiya. When I told a lot of my coworkers at the time when I was working at an English school, they were really surprised because just so it's easier for an American person to understand, the area that I lived in was Shin Imamiya, which is known to be one of the poorest areas of Kansai. It's basically saying that I moved from Compton to Beverly Hills, even though the place that I lived in was a bit cheaper because I couldn't afford a really expensive apartment. So I just wanted to talk about the main differences and my experience of moving from the poorest area of Japan to one of the richest parts of Kansai. The very first thing that I want to talk about is the cost of living and rent price. So when I lived in Shin Imamiya, my rent was 4万円, which is roughly about $250 USD per month. So the Shin Imamiya apartment was 1 LDK, so it was just one studio room apartment, compared to my Ashiya apartment. Even though my Ashiya apartment was 2 LDK and it was a bit bigger, the price was nearly double or almost 3 times the price of my Shin Imamiya apartment. I roughly paid 10万円, which is about 750 USD, which is still really cheap to be able to live in an apartment for that much. It's still, compared to America, a lot cheaper. I lived in an area called Iwazonocho within Ashiya Prefecture. When it came to the expenditure like Wi-Fi, gas, money, that didn't really change much. The thing that changed the most was definitely the price of the actual rent itself. So when I went from paying $250 for a room to $750, even though that's still really cheap in the scheme of, compared to prices in America, 500 extra US dollars was a lot more. I was still a very young guy working part-time as an English teacher. So at that time, it was a pretty big financial jump for me. So when it came to groceries, that was another big change. When I lived in Shin Imamiya, we had a shop called Tamade, which is known to be one of the cheapest grocery chains. There's so much variety for a really affordable price. My groceries were really cheap at the time. When I lived in the apartment in Ashiya, the only closest grocery store was a grocery shop called Ikari, which is known to be one of the most expensive in Kansai area. It's a very fancy grocery shop. There wasn't much of a variety that I could choose from when it came to grocery, especially right outside the door. To me, it felt like Ikari was a more expensive version of Whole Foods or something. Whole Foods is definitely seen as like a grocery shop that sells things a bit more organic and a bit higher priced. The shop that was right next to my house and the closest one, it felt like a very expensive place and I would barely buy anything. The only reason why I would shop at Ikari is if I was too tired or for an emergency, if I needed ingredients last minute for something that I was cooking. When it came to grocery prices, I definitely felt like I was spending a lot more money when I lived in Ashiya, just because there was less variety. There was a lot less budget grocery shops like Tamade, and another really famous one that I used to go to was Gyomu Supa, which is another very good grocery shop that I lived by when I was in Shin Imamiya. So the second biggest thing that I noticed between living in a poor area and an expensive area was the type of people. I just want to say this, and this is my opinion. I'm sure everyone has different experiences. In this video, I just want to say what I felt and things that I experienced myself. And I wanted to say that the people were different between these areas. When I lived in Shin Imamiya, there were a lot of families families and people of lower economic status, where Ashiya definitely has a lot of people with money. And Shin Imamiya was an area where I would just be walking down the street and people would give you a friendly smile. And Shin Imamiya was just a lot more lively as a city. There was a lot of people just walking about because it is a main city and it's on the southern part of Osaka. You definitely feel a lot of excitement when you're living there. And I think geographically, because Shin Imamiya felt a lot more condensed and pushed into a really small section, where Ashiya is very spread out, there's a lot of space in that area. I think that also kind of translates to the people. When I was walking down the street in Shin Imamiya, I would be very close to people because the streets were very narrow. Where in Ashiya, most people would drive, have their own cars and drive to the station or wherever they needed to go. So there wasn't much walking foot traffic, and that makes you feel really isolated in a way. Where in Shin Imamiya, you're really close knit with people, and I think that kind of translates to the type of community it makes for the people. So I definitely felt that in Shin Imamiya. It felt a lot warmer because you're closer to people. I think it makes people feel more at home and want to start more conversations at parks and stuff. But I'm not saying that Ashiya has really cold people. I'm just saying, in my experience, I just didn't have as much conversation with people in Ashiya, just because in my opinion, I thought that the layout of the city in Ashiya was a lot more spread out, especially in the area that I lived in called Iwazonocho. And the last thing that I thought was really different was just the overall environment and vibe of each city. Depending on what you like, I think a lot of people will want to choose Ashiya as opposed to Shin Imamiya. Even though I really like the price, the cost of living in Shin Imamiya, and there's many aspects that I really liked about living in that area, there were definitely a lot of things that I really liked about living in Ashiya, which is like the richer part. Because of the amount of space that you have, it doesn't feel as crammed. The environment is just way different. When you live in a really tight city like Shin Imamiya, you definitely have a lot more excitement. Things are happening. You could hear conversations on the street. You could hear just lots of noise. That's definitely a great thing to experience in Japan. If you're a type of person who's more introverted, you want a lot of space, you get more relaxation through having big sidewalks to walk on, then Ashiya will definitely be a lot more enjoyable. Because when I moved from Shin Imamiya to Ashiya, I actually had a lot of relief mentally, because when I lived in Shin Imamiya, it just felt like I was too pressured into this really small area in my small apartment, where when I lived in Ashiya, it was a lot more freeing mentally because I had more space, and the streets were always so quiet. I think the demographic of the people who live in Ashiya, I'm sure there's a lot of families in Ashiya, but it does seem like there's a lot more older people that live in Ashiya as opposed to Shin Imamiya. There's a lot of families and younger people who live in the city. But at the end of the day, I think both cities have the pros and cons. They're both beautiful cities for different reasons, and it just comes down to a personal preference. I personally like both of them equally, and the fact that I was able to experience living in both apartments is something that I'm really grateful about as well. Thanks for watching the video, and if you like videos like this and you want me to make more videos about my experiences of living in Japan, definitely let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.